A diamond ring changed hands in Paris for 1,100 French crowns, and the man who bought it had crossed the sea to choose a different woman entirely. The ring went onto the finger of a 16-year-old girl who could barely stand through her own wedding without something to lean on, and within 7 months she would be dead in a cold stone palace 400 miles from the only home she had ever known. The girl was Madeleine of Valois, and the ring, that little circle of gold and stone, is one of the very few hard, accountable, written-down facts in a story that almost everyone afterward chose to remember as something soft and beautiful and unbearably sad. She has a nickname, this girl. People who know her at all, which isn't many, know her as the Summer Queen. We'll get to where that came from, because it's grimmer than it sounds, and it's also, in a strange way, a little kinder than the plain truth of what happened to her. But before any of that, let me say hello properly. Welcome back to the channel, and if you've just found this one, settle in, because this is a long, slow one, and I'm glad you're here for it. Quick thing before we go under, I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments, the town, the country, whatever you feel like sharing, because there's something about the fact that this many people, scattered across this many places, all chose to sit down and spend an evening with someone who's been gone for nearly 500 years. And to everyone who keeps this channel alive, who comments, who shares these with a friend who likes the sad ones, thank you. Right. Back to the girl with the gold crown who couldn't stand up straight. She was born on the 10th of August, 1520, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which sits up on a rise of ground west of Paris with the river Seine curling away below it. It was a royal palace, one of her family's great houses, and her father was in the middle of turning it into something grander still, all pale Renaissance stone and long galleries, and the particular kind of spending that doesn't really seem to have a flaw to it. She arrived into the most dazzling court in Europe at quite possibly the most dazzling moment that court ever knew. Just weeks before she was born, her father had been standing in a field outside Calais, dressed in cloth of gold, in a contest with the King of England over who could appear more magnificent. The field of the cloth of gold, they called it. Tents made of actual gold thread, fountains that ran with wine instead of water, temporary palaces thrown up in a meadow purely to be looked at and then taken down again. It is, when you say it plainly, a faintly ridiculous thing to host. He hosted it like a man with something to prove, which he had. Her father was Francis I, King of France, and you need a feel for him before you can understand what happened to his daughter, so let me try to draw him for you. Tall, broad, athletic, with a long nose that every portraitist seems to have leaned into, and a charm that contemporaries kept inventing new words to describe. He hunted with an obsessive, almost desperate energy. He chased women openly, constantly, all his life, in a way nobody at court even pretended not to notice. He loved buildings and paintings and clever men, and he spent on all three the way other people breathe. He is the king who coaxed Leonardo da Vinci out of Italy to live his last years at a manor near Amboise, in France. And when Leonardo died there in 1519, the year before Madeleine was born, Francis ended up with the painting we now call the Mona Lisa, which is still in France today because of him. He built or rebuilt half the famous chateau you could name off the top of your head. Chambord, with that impossible double helix staircase where two people can climb and never meet. Fontainebleau, Blois, the Louvre. Saint-Germain itself, where this baby was born. He was a kind of force of weather in human form, a spender of fortunes, a collector of beautiful things. And toward his children, when the mood took him, he could be genuinely, softly tender, especially toward this one, especially toward Madeleine, because almost from the very start there was something wrong with her, and he knew it, and it frightened him. It's worth sitting in that court for a moment, because it's the world she was born into, and it shapes how strange her ending feels. The French court of Francis I was not a fixed place. It moved. It was a vast, restless, traveling household of thousands, dragging itself from chateau to chateau across the kingdom, the king at the center of it, hunting and feasting and governing on the road, with carts full of furniture and tapestries and plate rolling along behind, so that wherever the king stopped, a palace could be assembled around him out of his own baggage. Bare stone rooms were hung overnight with hangings the size of walls. Beds were carried in pieces and put back together. The court ate, danced, schemed and slept, and then it picked itself up and moved on to the next great house, leaving the last one empty again. That endless, restless luxury was the air Madeleine first breathed, and a sickly child does not travel well. A sickly child needs stillness and warmth and routine, all the things that a great roaming Renaissance court could not easily give. So already, almost from infancy, she didn't quite fit the rhythm of the world she'd been born into. She had to be held a little apart from it, and the splendor of that court was real, not just the boasting of flatterers. Francis spent on art and learning in a way that genuinely reshaped France. He gathered painters and sculptors and architects from Italy and set them loose. He collected ancient manuscripts. He founded what would become a great royal library. His sister, Madeleine's aunt Marguerite, ran her own brilliant little world of poets and reformers and free thinkers within his larger one. So this was not a dull or a brutish household. It was learned, glittering, ambitious, alive with ideas and beauty and money. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the very best places in all of Europe to be born a girl of high rank in the year 1520, and it could not save a single one of its children from a fever. That's the quiet cruelty sitting underneath all the gold. All that wealth, all that learning, all those clever men, and when a child began to waste away, the most powerful court in Europe could do nothing at all but keep her warm and pray. Her mother is the part of this story that people skip past, and I don't want to skip her, partly because she's the key to absolutely everything that comes afterward. To understand the daughter, sit a moment with the mother. Her mother was Queen Claude, Duchess of Brittany in her own right, daughter of the previous King of France, married off to Francis when she was 14 years old, and Claude was not a well woman. Contemporaries describe her as very short, very small, with a curvature of the spine that gave her a hunched back, and a problem with her hip, inherited from her own mother, that left her lame. She walked with a limp that got worse as she aged. One eye had a squint. The ambassadors of foreign powers, who were professionally, casually cruel about royal bodies in the secret letters they sent home, recorded all of it. The smallness, the limp, the plainness of her face. And then, almost without exception, even those cold men added something else. That she was gentle, that she was deeply pious, that she was kind to everyone around her, high or low. The old chronicler Brantôme called her very good, and very charitable, and very gentle to all. That's the woman at the root of this, small and in pain, and gentle, married at 14 to a giant of a man who would spend their entire marriage chasing other women around his own beautiful palaces, while she did the one thing nobody ever questioned that she was for. And here is the thing that quietly breaks your heart about Claude before we've even properly arrived at her daughter. She spent nearly her whole married life pregnant, 7 children in something like 9 years. Pregnancy after pregnancy after pregnancy, her small, already suffering body, the curved spine, the bad hip, made to do this over and over and over, with barely a gap to recover in between, until it simply wore through. She died at the Château de Blois in the summer of 1524, somewhere around the 20th of July, used up. She was 24 years old. The exact medical cause nobody can give you with any confidence from this distance. The plain answer is exhaustion, her body breaking under relentless childbearing. Some have suggested complications from a pregnancy or a miscarriage. Some have floated bone tuberculosis, the same family of disease that may have shadowed her daughter. There's even an old, ugly rumor that her husband had given her syphilis, which you will see repeated in places, but which nobody can actually prove. What we can say plainly is that a girl who began life with a twisted spine and a lame hip was put through 7 pregnancies in 9 years and was dead before her 25th birthday. Madeleine was 4 years old when her mother died, maybe just barely 4. Old enough perhaps to hold on to 1 or 2 fragments of memory, a face, a voice, a hand. Probably not old enough to hold on to much. We don't get to know what she remembered. Nobody wrote it down. 4-year-olds don't get asked. And Madeleine, it seems, inherited her mother's body. Not the spine as far as we can tell, not the lame hip, but the fragility underneath it, that sense which clings to her in every source, that this was a person the world could break without even seeming to try. Every account that touches her reaches for the exact same word, frail, frail from birth. There was something delicate woven into her from the very beginning, and her father, who had just stood and watched his small, gentle wife wear herself into the grave, looked at this little girl and made a decision. A deliberate one. He was going to protect her, even knowing exactly where it leads. Francis kept Madeleine out of Paris. Paris, by the standards of the day, was cold and damp, and full of what they thought of as bad air. So instead, he had her raised down in the Loire Valley, in the soft, warm, green middle of France, in chateaux like Amboise and Blois, because, in the words that come down to us across the centuries, he feared that the cold would destroy her delicate health. Her own father believed that cold air alone could kill this child. He arranged her whole childhood deliberately around keeping her warm. Hold on to that quietly in the back of your mind, because it returns at the end of this story. And when it returns, it is genuinely terrible. She was passed after her mother's death into the care of her aunt, Marguerite, the king's sister, who was one of the most formidable minds in all of Europe. A writer, a thinker, a patron of scholars and reformers, a woman whose own court became a haven for clever and dangerous ideas. So the little frail princess was raised, at least for a while, by one of the sharpest women alive. Later, Madeleine and her younger sister Margaret moved into the household of their stepmother, Eleanor of Austria, after Francis remarried in 1530. So picture gently the shape of her upbringing: clever, capable, powerful women, warm places, soft southern light. The whole arrangement built around the careful preservation of something fragile and precious. And in that warmth, for a while, against the odds, she grew. What that care actually looked like, day to day, we can sketch from what we know of how the age treated its delicate children, and it's a strange mixture of tenderness and helplessness. A sickly royal child would have been watched constantly, wrapped warmly, kept out of draughts, fed carefully on the foods physicians of the day believed strengthened a weak constitution, bled, very possibly because bleeding was the great all-purpose remedy of the era, applied to almost everything whether it helped or harmed. Dosed with syrups and possets and herbal preparations, some soothing, some useless, some quietly poisonous. Kept from too much excitement, too much exertion, too much cold air. Her physicians would have studied her urine, felt her pulse, balanced her humors, prescribed warmth and rest and gentle diet, and watched and waited and hoped. None of it could touch the actual disease because nobody knew what the actual disease was. They were treating a body carefully and lovingly without the faintest real idea of what was eating it. Attentive, expensive and blind, the whole world of medicine she was raised inside. Some of the things they'd have tried on a wasting patient are grim to consider now. Bleeding a person who was already weak and pale, opening a vein to drain off blood the body could not spare, in the belief it would rebalance her. Purges to empty the stomach and bowels, leaving her weaker still. Strange concoctions, powdered substances, gemstones ground up and swallowed because precious things were thought to carry precious virtues, animal parts, herbs gathered under particular conditions, all of it administered with total confidence and zero understanding. A consumptive girl might be dosed and bled and purged for years, each intervention very likely doing more harm than good. Her doctors growing no closer to the truth of what ailed her. And the awful thing is that the kindest, gentlest care available, the warm rooms and the soft food and the rest, was also the only part that didn't actively hurt her, and it was the part her father had given her all along. The cutting-edge medicine of the age was largely useless against tuberculosis, and some of it was worse than useless. The best thing anyone could do for her was keep her warm and comfortable and wait, which makes the choice to send her north all the more wrenching, and being raised apart, being the delicate one, being held back from the great roaming court while her healthier siblings rode out into it, that does something to a childhood too. We don't have her own words about it, no diary, no confession, nothing where she tells us how it felt to be the one who had to stay behind, the one everyone worried over, the one the cold could kill. But you can see the shape of the life even without her telling you. A girl raised in quieter rooms, in warmer valleys, a little separate from the noise and the movement, watched over by anxious adults, growing up with the steady background knowledge that her own body was the enemy, that the thing she had to fear most was simply herself. Whatever else that produced, it seems to have produced someone with a fierce, surprising will. Because when the moment came, this carefully kept, much worried over girl made one enormous decision for herself, and she made it against everyone, and she got her way. Let me give you the rest of the family quickly, because they matter for what comes later, and because, frankly, the death rate among these children is staggering, and it tells you something blunt and true about what being a royal child actually was. The eldest, Louise, died as a tiny girl before Madeleine was even born. The next, Charlotte, died of measles in 1524, the same terrible year that took their mother. So Madeleine, at 4 years old, lost a mother and a sister within months of each other. The eldest boy was Francis, the Dauphin, the heir to everything. Then Henry, who would one day become Henry II of France. Then Madeleine herself. Then Charles. Then little Margaret, the baby of them all. 7 children, and by the time the worst of the early dying had passed, 3 of them were already gone. A row of small graves and a handful of survivors, raised in the shadow of how easily they could go. That was her family, and the dying didn't stop with childhood, which is part of what makes this family such a grim one to follow. The eldest boy, the Dauphin Francis, the heir his whole family's hopes rested on, the brother who'd spent years as a hostage in Spain, dropped dead suddenly in 1536, the year before Madeleine's wedding, after drinking a cup of cold water following a game of tennis. He was 18. His death was so sudden and so convenient for certain people that it set off poisoning accusations and a show trial, and a man was horribly executed for it, torn apart, though most historians now think the boy simply died of natural causes, possibly the same tubercular weakness that ran through the bloodline. So, in the very stretch of months when Madeleine was falling for her Scottish king, her eldest brother died young and ugly amid whispers of poison. Death was simply a constant houseguest in this family. They buried children, and then they buried the grown survivors of those children, and the wasting illnesses and the sudden collapses kept coming. Madeleine was born into a family that was extremely good at producing heirs, and extremely bad at keeping them alive, and she fit that pattern exactly. Another bright, short-lived Valois who flared up and went out young. Now, while Madeleine was still small, something happened to her family, to her whole country really, that I have to tell you about, because it cast a long, cold shadow over her entire childhood. A national catastrophe that reaches all the way down into a nursery and changes the temperature of a house, even a warm one in the south. In 1525, when Madeleine was about 4 or 5 years old, her father went off to fight in Italy and was utterly destroyed at a place called Pavia. Not merely beaten, captured. The King of France himself, taken prisoner on the battlefield by the forces of his great lifelong rival, the Emperor Charles V. Francis wrote a letter to his mother afterward that became famous across Europe, in which he said that of everything all was lost to him save honor and life. He was carried off to Madrid and held there as a prisoner, and to win his freedom he had to sign a punishing treaty. and as a guarantee that he would keep his word once he was back home and powerful again, he handed over the two most precious securities he had, his two eldest sons, the Dauphin Francis, about 7 years old, and Henry, about 8, Madeleine's own brothers. Those two little boys were sent down into Spain and held there for around 4 years. They went in as pampered princes, treated well at first, and the conditions slowly, steadily soured until they were being watched and confined like the hostages they actually were. There are accounts of their world shrinking, of comforts being stripped away, of 2 children far from home growing harder and quieter. They did not come back to France until 1530, and they only came back then because they were ransomed for a fortune so enormous it stops meaning anything when you say it. 2 million gold écus. The details of that captivity are genuinely bleak, and they're part of the family weather Madeleine grew up breathing, so they're worth a moment. By the worst of it, the 2 boys, still only children, were reportedly kept shut up in a bare, dark room with barred windows, the comforts and the French servants taken away, allowed almost nothing of the soft, princely life they'd been born to. When their father had been the prisoner, he'd at least been a grown king who'd chosen his war. These were small boys handed over as collateral, locked in a foreign fortress for years. Their childhood spent as living IOUs for a treaty their father signed and then tried to wriggle out of. By the time they came home, they'd half forgotten their own French and had to relearn it. The younger of the 2, Henry, the boy who'd grow up to be king, seems to have carried that captivity for the rest of his life. A coldness, a hardness, a streak of melancholy that people traced back to those locked Spanish years. So when you look at Madeleine, tucked away warm in the Loire, understand that her nearest brothers had been traded away into a dark cell to buy their father's freedom, and came back changed. That's the household. That's the family she belonged to. So when you picture the household Madeleine actually grew up inside, even from the warm safety of the Loire, picture this: a dead mother, a dead sister, a father who had been the prisoner of his enemy and had come home humbled. 2 brothers held as hostages in a foreign land for years of their boyhood, locked in the dark, ransomed for a king's fortune, a kingdom run, for a stretch, by her grandmother as regent. Loss and absence and ransom and fear, all of it the weather she grew up in. One small, fragile girl tucked away in the warm valleys, being kept alive while the rest of her family bled. By the time she was a young teenager, whatever was wrong with her had taken a clearer shape. The standard description, the one you'll find in most accounts of her life, is that by around her 16th birthday, she had developed tuberculosis. Consumption, they called it then. The wasting disease. The slow one. And here I want to be honest with you about the edges of what we can know, because I'd much rather be honest than sound more certain than I am. Nobody in the 1530s could diagnose tuberculosis the way a modern doctor could. The bacterium, the actual cause, wouldn't be identified for more than 300 years. What people at the time could see and write down were the symptoms: frailty, fever, a persistent flowing of rheum and phlegm that they called catarrh. The closest, best description we have of her particular illness comes from one of her own gentlewomen, a Frenchwoman in her household who was with her at the end and reported on it afterward. She said that Madeleine had no good days, that she was always sickly with a catarrh that descended into her stomach, and that this was the cause of her death. Whether that was tuberculosis settled in the lungs, or some other slow wasting illness, or several things tangled together, you simply cannot prove from this far away. But consumption fits the picture we have, it fits the family history, it fits the slow fragility that had clung to her since birth. And it's where nearly everyone who has studied her life lands. So that's where we'll sit too. A girl being quietly, steadily hollowed out from the inside by something her doctors could neither name nor touch. Consumption is worth understanding a little, because it tells you what was actually happening inside her over those years, and because it explains why everyone around her felt so completely powerless. It's an ancient disease. The Greeks knew it and named it, calling it phthisis, which means, roughly, a wasting away. And that's exactly what it does. What it did to her. It hollows the body out slowly. The person grows thinner, paler, weaker. Fevers come and go, often worse in the evenings, often with night sweats that soak the bedclothes through. The cough sets in, dry at first, and then bringing up matter, and in the worst stretches, blood. The appetite fails. The flesh seems to melt off the bones while the eyes grow strangely large and bright in a thinning face. It can move fast, or it can drag on for years, flaring and then easing, letting the sufferer believe they're recovering, and then closing in again. That cruel pattern of false hope is part of the disease, written into how it behaves, and you'll see it play out in Madeleine's own letters before the end. The Age called it consumption precisely because the patient appeared to be consumed, eaten, used up by something invisible. And the physicians of the 1530s had no real idea what caused it. They reached for the old Greek explanations, ulcerations of the lungs, imbalances in the body's humors, bad air, inherited weakness. Some of them suspected, correctly as it turned out, that it could spread from person to person, but a true understanding of why was still centuries off. There was no cure, there was nothing that worked. The very best the Age could offer a consumptive patient was a change of air, a move to a warmer, gentler, drier climate, plenty of rest, careful feeding, sea voyages sometimes, calm and warmth and quiet. That advice is going to matter enormously and bitterly very soon, so hold it loosely in your mind. The one thing 16th century medicine genuinely believed might help a girl like Madeleine was warmth and mild air. Keep that there. It comes back as the cruelest joke in the whole story. That's France. That's the warm valley, and the sick princess and the frightened protective father. Now I have to take you north, because the other half of this story was growing up at exactly the same time, in a far harder country, under a far harder hand, in a place where absolutely nobody was being kept warm. His name was James, the 5th Scottish king to carry it, and his childhood makes Madeleine's sheltered one look like a long, gentle afternoon. He was born in April 1512 at Linlithgow Palace, a handsome royal house set on the edge of a loch in central Scotland. His mother was Margaret Tudor, the elder sister of Henry VIII of England. So this Scottish king was, by blood, Henry's own nephew, a family connection that turns out to matter enormously by the end of all this. And James became king at 17 months old. Not because of any plan, any orderly succession, because in September 1513 his father, James IV, led an army down into England and was killed at Flodden, along with a truly horrifying portion of the Scottish nobility. The flower of the country, cut down in a single afternoon on a hillside, an archbishop, bishops, earls, lords by the dozen, thousands of ordinary men, and the king himself, his body afterward carried from the field. So a toddler in a cradle at Linlithgow inherited a kingdom that had just, in the space of a few hours, had its head cut off. What follows for that boy is about 15 years of grown men fighting over him like a prize. His mother served as regent until she remarried and lost the position. Then a duke took over. And then, worst of all, his own stepfather, Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus, who from around 1525 took physical hold of the young king and kept him for some 3 years as something disturbingly close to a prisoner. The accounts describe Angus keeping James surrounded by pleasures, gifts, distractions, amusements his guardians called unsuitable, anything to keep the boy occupied, soft and pliable, while Angus ruled the country in his name and pocketed the power. Think about what that does to a teenage king, indulged and watched at the same time, given everything except freedom. James grew to hate Angus with a depth and a permanence that never really left him for the rest of his life. And then, at 16, James got himself free. In 1528, he slipped out of Edinburgh in disguise, rode hard through the night for Stirling Castle, where his mother held the walls, and from there he raised men, turned on Angus, drove him into exile in England, and began to rule for himself at last, free, finally, and furious, and shaped, top to bottom, by all of it. I'm spending this time on his childhood for a reason that's really about her, about Madeleine, so stay with me, because when these two finally met, what you have side by side are two badly damaged young people. Her, raised in warmth and worry, the fragile one, kept safe and kept apart, hollowing out from a disease nobody could name. Him, raised in cold and captivity, the orphan king, used and managed and held prisoner by the very people meant to protect him, fatherless since before he could remember. Two people who'd each, in completely opposite ways, had something essential taken from their childhoods, and something in them recognized something in the other. That's the meeting we're building toward, not a calculated dynastic handshake, though it was supposed to be exactly that. Something more like two wounded people finding each other across a crowded room, which makes what happens afterward worse, not better. The man James grew into is complicated, and I'm not going to flatten him into a simple villain or a simple romantic hero, because he was honestly neither and a bit of both. He's been described as highly strung and intelligent, a man who swung between black depressions and bursts of restless, feverish energy. He could be grasping with money, hard on his nobles, suspicious by temperament, and capable of real, lasting vindictiveness toward the families he believed had wronged him as a boy. He also had a reputation among ordinary Scots as the poor man's king, because he liked to travel his own country in disguise, calling himself the Goodman of Ballengeich, walking among common people unrecognized, and there are warm folk stories that grew up around that habit. And, like his future father-in-law down in France, he was a builder. Falkland, Stirling, Linlithgow, Holyrood, all of them transformed under his reign into something more elegant, more French, more like the glittering courts he envied from a cold distance. He fathered a great many children outside of marriage by a long series of mistresses, at least 9 that we can actually count, before he ever took a wife. So by his early 20s, he was an experienced, hardened, somewhat haunted king, carrying a chip on his shoulder roughly the size of his entire stolen childhood. And he needed a wife. Specifically, by an old treaty signed before he could walk, he needed a French one. Scotland itself is worth a quick word here, because it's the place she's going to die in, and its reputation in France was not gentle. To a daughter of the warm French court, Scotland was the edge of the known world. Cold, wet, far, poor, by French standards, a kingdom of grey stone and grey sky and a grey sea, ruled by a king whose nobles were famously violent and famously hard to control. Its weather was a thing French courtiers talked about with something close to a shudder. The wind off the North Sea, the rain that came sideways, the long, dark winters. For a healthy young woman, it would have been a daunting place to be sent. For a girl whose body could supposedly be killed by cold alone, it was, frankly, the worst destination in Christendom her father could possibly have chosen for her. And he knew it. Everyone knew it. That knowledge is sitting in the room the whole time the marriage gets negotiated, like a guest nobody wants to look at directly. The reason for that reaches back before either he or Madeleine was born. France and Scotland had this long, durable, centuries-old friendship that historians call the Old Alliance. The Old Alliance, built mostly on the simple fact that they shared an enemy, England, sitting right between them on the map. After the catastrophe at Flodden, the two countries renewed their bond with a treaty signed at Rouen in 1517. And folded into that treaty was a promise. The King of Scots would marry a daughter of the King of France. At the time that promise was made, James was about 5 years old, and the French king's eldest daughter was barely a year old. 2 small children, betrothed on paper as a piece of foreign policy, the way you'd sign a trade agreement, with no thought at all to who they'd grow up to be. So the marriage of James to a French princess was, in a sense, settled before Madeleine was ever the candidate for it. The question that dragged on for years, that got negotiated and renegotiated, was which French princess? And that question is exactly where Madeleine's health comes crashing back into the center of the story. The negotiations got serious in the early 1530s. And the French side kept slamming into the same wall again and again, and the wall was Madeleine's body. She was the obvious choice by age and by rank, the king's own daughter of about the right years, but she was too sick. By late 1534, the French were openly, almost apologetically, admitting that she wasn't fit for it, that her health couldn't carry the weight of a Scottish marriage and a Scottish crown. So Francis proposed a swap. A different young woman, Marie de Bourbon, the daughter of the Duke of Vendôme, not a princess of the royal blood, a step down in rank, but Francis offered to dower her as richly as if she were his own daughter, to sweeten the deal enough that Scotland would take her instead. James sent one of his heralds across the sea to look her over and report back. A marriage contract was even drawn up and sealed in the spring of 1536. So, on paper, it was done. James was going to marry Marie de Bourbon. And Madeleine, the sick one, the fragile one, was going to be spared the whole northern ordeal entirely. And then James decided he wanted to go and see for himself. This is one of those moments where the story turns almost like an old folk tale, and I'll tell it to you the way it comes down to us, with the quiet understanding that some of the romance probably got polished onto it later, the way these things always do. In the autumn of 1536, James crossed over to France. The tradition holds that he travelled in disguise, incognito, so he could get a real look at his promised bride without her knowing who he was. And honestly, that fits everything we know about the man, the goodman of Ballengeich, who liked to move through the world unrecognized. He went to see Marie de Bourbon at Saint-Quentin, up in Picardy, and stayed about a week. And he was not impressed. Whatever it was he had crossed the sea hoping to find in her, Marie de Bourbon was not it. So he moved on to the French royal court itself, travelling to meet the king and his family somewhere in the country between Roanne and Lyon in the middle of October. And there, at court, he met Madeleine, 16 years old. Sick, yes. Frail, yes. Already marked by whatever was slowly killing her. But by every account that survives, he laid eyes on her, and that was it. That was the whole thing decided in a glance. Spare a thought for Marie de Bourbon in all this, because she's the woman who gets written out of the romance, and she was a real person with real feelings who got rejected by a foreign king who'd come specifically to inspect her and found her wanting. She had been promised this marriage. A contract had been drawn up. She'd have known she was to be a queen, that ships and ceremonies and a whole new life were being arranged around her. And then the king crossed the sea, looked at her for a week, and quietly decided he'd rather have someone else, someone sicker, someone he met afterward, almost by accident. We don't have her side of it. We rarely get the side of the woman who was passed over. But she's there in the story. A young noblewoman who was good enough to sign a contract for and not good enough to keep, set aside the moment a princess with a prettier face and a dying body walked into the room. The romance that's so sweet from Madeleine's side has a cold edge from Marie's. These dynastic matches always have someone standing just out of frame, holding a contract that's suddenly worth nothing. They fell for each other. Now, I'm always a little cautious about love in these arranged marriage stories, because half the time, when a chronicler writes that two royals fell in love, what he's really doing is dressing up a cold dynastic transaction to make it read more sweetly for posterity. But in Madeleine's case, the evidence genuinely points that way, and it points that way because of what James actually did next. What he did next was throw over the signed, sealed, sensible, fully negotiated contract with Marie de Bourbon and demand Madeleine instead. The sick one, the fragile one, the one her own father had spent 16 careful years keeping out of the cold and the damp and the bad air precisely so she would stay alive. James looked at the safe choice and the dangerous choice, and he chose the dangerous one on purpose because he wanted her. And Francis said no. This is the part of the story I find genuinely painful, because it's a father who can see with total clarity exactly what is coming and who tries to stop it. Francis refused at first to allow the marriage, and the reason given is plain, and in hindsight it's devastating. He feared that the harsh climate of Scotland would prove fatal to his daughter's already failing health. Of course he did. He had organized her entire existence around the belief that cold could kill her. He had kept her in the warm Loire for 16 years for precisely this reason. And now here was a king from one of the coldest, dampest, most northern courts in all of Europe, asking to carry her off to live there, permanently. Everything Francis had ever feared for her, gathered up and handed to him in the shape of a marriage proposal from a man his daughter had just fallen for. But James pressed, and, crucially, so did Madeleine herself. The accounts are clear and consistent on this point. She wanted it. She made her own interest in the marriage very obvious, openly, repeatedly, and her father gave way only after she had made her wishes completely plain. So sit for a second with what that actually means. A 16-year-old girl dying slowly by inches who falls for a Scottish king and then insists, against her terrified father's objections, against the advice of physicians, against the warnings of careful counsellors in 2 kingdoms, on marrying this man and sailing north into the precise climate that everyone in her life has spent 16 years keeping her away from. Whatever you want to call that, it is not the behavior of a passive pawn being moved around a board. She chose it. With open eyes, knowing she was unwell, she chose the cold. She chose him. Francis relented. The marriage contract was signed in late November 1536, and the financial terms were lavish, because Francis, even afraid, even grieving in advance, was absolutely not going to send his daughter off looking poor. She would bring a dowry of 100,000 écus, with a further 30,000 francs settled on James. She renounced, as these contracts always demanded, any claim for herself or for her future children to the throne of France, and, should James die before her, she was to be kept for the rest of her life in real splendour, holding a whole string of Scottish earldoms and palaces and castles. On paper, she was being set up to be a queen with deep roots in her new kingdom, secure for life, honoured, wealthy, planted. On paper, as we'll see, didn't get much of a chance. You can read those terms 2 ways, and both of them are a little heartbreaking. The generous, optimistic reading is that a loving father, having lost the argument, threw everything he had into making sure his daughter would be safe, rich, and protected in her new country, secured against widowhood, cushioned against every misfortune he could foresee. The colder reading is that those clauses about what she'd hold if James died first are the clauses of a man who knew, in his bones, that this marriage was a gamble against her body, and who was quietly making sure that if the worst came, his daughter wouldn't also be left poor. He'd watched his wife die young. He was watching his daughter sicken. The man drawing up these careful provisions for her widowhood may simply have been a father planning, with a heavy hand, for a future he already half expected. We can't read his mind, but the precautions are there in the document, written down, oddly specific, and they sit strangely, next to all the wedding gold. The wedding was a Valois spectacle, and Francis spent on it like a man who was either celebrating a triumph or grieving a loss. And the truthful answer is probably that he was doing both at the same time, with the same money. It happened at Notre Dame de Paris on the 1st of January 1537, New Year's Day. The cathedral you've seen in 1,000 photographs, the one that very nearly burned to the ground in our own time, that one, with its great towers and its rose windows, packed and blazing with the French court at full, deliberate, overwhelming strength. The day before, the couple had made a grand ceremonial entry into the city of Paris, through arches built specially for them, past crowds. And for the wedding itself, they built a raised wooden walkway, a platform, running all the way from the bishop's palace straight to the doors of the cathedral, so that the bride could process above the heads of the watching crowd, lifted up on display, the whole city looking up at her. The Cardinal de Bourbon performed the ceremony. Madeleine wore a crown of gold on her head, and beneath it a coif of gold set with precious stones, and the rest of what she wore matched it. Sumptuous, heavy with worked gold and gems, exactly the way a king's daughter was expected to look on the single day she became a queen. 3 great ladies attended her, dressed in cloth of gold and decked out, in the words of an English observer who was there, gorgeously, as waiters of the bride. The English diplomats present, who sent detailed reports home to a court that was hungry for any scrap of intelligence about the French, could not stop describing the fabric. The cloth of gold gowns of the French ladies, one of them wrote, were smothered, that's his actual word, smothered in embroidery and pearls and gemstones. James's own Scottish gentleman had been done up in the French fashion for the occasion and looked, the report admits, with just a little national grudging, right well apparelled. You can feel the writer not wanting to give the Scots the satisfaction and being forced to anyway. That night there was a banquet in the great hall of the old royal palace, on the island in the Seine, and at the end of it James and some others came in dancing, in a masque, a costumed performance, an elaborate piece of courtly entertainment the French did better than anyone alive. And then, for about 2 weeks afterward, the celebrations rolled on. Tournaments, jousting in the lists, feasting at the Louvre and at other royal houses. The papacy even got in on the occasion, sending James some of its very highest honours, a blessed sword and a blessed hat, and the grand resounding title of Defender of the Faith, because the Pope was desperately, anxiously hoping that this devoutly Catholic Scottish king would hold the line against his uncle Henry VIII, who at that very moment was busy tearing England loose from Rome. So there's a darker thread running underneath the festivities, but we'll leave Henry's troubles to one side for now and keep our eyes on the bride. The point is the scale of it. Months of celebration. The most expensive, most magnificent wedding the French court could possibly throw. Every fabric, every jewel, every ceremony, every honor pushed to its absolute limit. Try to hold the 2 pictures together, because the whole tragedy of her lives in the gap between them. On one side, the spectacle. The walkway built above the crowd, the crown of gold and the coif set with stones, the cloth of gold ladies smothered in pearls, the jousts, the masks, the blessed sword from Rome, the most powerful court in Europe, pouring out its wealth in waves to celebrate this single marriage. And on the other side, at the dead center of it all, a 16-year-old girl who was dying, and who everyone present knew was dying, propped up and crowned and walked through weeks of exhausting ceremony, because that's what a royal wedding required and because she had insisted on having it. The magnificence and the frailty are not separate things in her story. They're happening in the same body, in the same rooms, on the same days. The brighter the spectacle blazed, the smaller and more breakable the girl at the heart of it looked. And nobody stopped it, because she didn't want it stopped. And at the dead center of all of it stood a bride who was visibly, undeniably, unmistakably ill. And that is not hindsight talking. That's not us looking back and reading the ending into the beginning. People at the time could see it. People at the time said so, out loud, in writing. Wise counselors on both sides had argued against the entire match openly on the simple grounds of her health. One old account puts it almost gently. It says that sage counselors of both countries discommended the union, advised firmly against it, but that the young princess easily induced her father to consent. She talked him into it. The girl in the gold crown, the one who could barely make it through her own wedding ceremony without leaning on something, had wanted this badly enough to override every cautious, frightened adult in two kingdoms. There's a kind of terrible willpower in that, in a dying 16-year-old simply deciding she would have the thing she wanted and bending two royal courts to it. And the diamond ring I opened with is woven right into all this gold and spectacle, by the way. James bought a diamond spousing ring for the wedding for 1,100 French crowns. That same year, his accounts also record him buying a diamond cross, set with 20 diamonds, for a few hundred crowns more. He was spending too, not just receiving her dowry. He had wanted her, badly, and he dressed that wanting up in stones and gold, the way men of that world did. After the wedding, they did not leave for Scotland, not for months. Partly the weather, it was deep winter and the cold northern sea is no place at all to be in January. And partly, plainly, her. She was not well enough to make the journey, and everyone around her knew it. So they stayed on in France through the early part of 1537, drifting between royal houses, Chantilly, Senlis, Compiègne, resting at one chateau and then another. At Rouen, by some accounts, she fell ill again, badly enough to hold things up still further. The marriage that had been in such a desperate hurry to actually happen now somehow could not seem to depart. The girl who had insisted on going to Scotland kept being too unwell to go. Those last months in France have their own quiet poignancy when you sit with them. This was the last of France she would ever have. The last warm rooms, the last familiar faces, the last of the country her father had kept her safe in for 16 years. She was a married queen now, bound for the north, and these were the closing weeks of the only world she'd ever known, drifting from one beloved house to the next, sometimes well enough to travel, sometimes laid up sick again. Whether she understood these as goodbyes, we can't know. She still believed, as far as we can tell, that she was going to recover, that she'd be well once she settled, that the Scottish life ahead of her was a real future and not a short coda. So she may not have felt the weight of it the way we do, looking back. knowing she'd be in the ground within months of leaving. She may have spent those last French weeks simply impatient to get going, to reach her husband's kingdom, to begin. The young don't usually feel their last things as last things. That's part of the mercy and part of the cruelty of being 16. But by May, the weather had finally turned, and the excuses had finally run out, and the fleet was ready. And it was an extraordinary fleet. So let me describe to you what actually sailed out of France carrying her. They left from the Norman coast, from Le Havre, in May 1537. And the ships were a floating treasury, and I mean that almost literally. By the report of an English herald who was watching the whole situation very closely from his post, the Berwick Pursuivant, a man named Henry Ray, there were 10 French ships and 4 Scottish ones. Among them the Salamander, one of 3 vessels that Francis had given to James outright as part of the marriage settlement, gifts of warships from one king to another, and the cargo. A Scottish chronicler, John Leslie, the Bishop of Ross, listed out what those ships carried, and it reads like the inventory of a dragon's hoard. Besides the Queen's own furnishings, he wrote, her hangings, her wardrobe, all of it loaded and carried north, there were many costly jewels, and golden work, and precious stones, and orient pearl, the most excellent of any sort that was in all of Europe, and many costly adornments for her body, with much silver work, costly cupboards, cups, and plate. Francis had loaded his dying daughter's ships with Arras tapestries, with cloths of estate, with rich beds, with 2 whole cupboards of gilded silver plate, with Persian carpets. By one account, Madeleine herself went through the French royal wardrobe and personally chose the furnishings she wanted to bring. A frail girl picking out the soft furnishings and the silver for a home she was going to live in for 7 weeks. She didn't know that, of course. She thought she was choosing the things she'd grow old among. The crossing itself, we don't have a minute-by-minute account of, but you honestly don't need one to feel it. The North Sea in spring is cold and rough and an unbroken iron grey. And she was already sick before she ever stepped aboard, and seasickness piled on top of consumption, on a wooden ship pitching in open water for days, is its own small private hell. On the 15th of May, English sailors out on the water sold fish to the passing fleet, off the Northumberland coast, near Bamborough Head. Royalty and treasure, and a dying 16-year-old queen, all of it sliding past on the grey water, and somebody rowed out and sold them a load of fish. Ordinary life just carrying calmly on alongside the grand, slow tragedy, not even noticing it was there. Sit with what that voyage was actually like for her, though, because it's grim, and it doesn't usually get told. A 16th century sea crossing was an ordeal for a healthy, robust traveller. The ships were cramped, wooden, foul-smelling, lurching constantly. There was no privacy, no real comfort, no escape from the motion. People who were perfectly well came off these voyages green and shaking. Now put a girl with advanced lung disease into the middle of that. Days of it, the endless pitch and roll, the damp salt cold soaking into everything, the sickness that comes in waves and won't stop, the impossibility of resting, of keeping food down, of getting warm. A consumptive body needs stillness and warmth and gentle air, and instead she got a week on the open North Sea in a tossing wooden hull, the one environment almost perfectly designed to break a person in her condition. By the time those ships reached Scotland, whatever reserves of strength she'd had left were very likely spent. She'd insisted on this. She'd talked 2 kingdoms into letting her do it, and the doing of it, the actual physical crossing, may well have been the thing that pushed her past saving. She sailed toward her new life, and the journey itself helped kill her. They reached Leith, the port that serves Edinburgh, at 10 o'clock at night on the eve of Whitsun, the 19th of May, 1537. And the evidence is clear, and it is consistent. Madeleine arrived gravely ill. Whatever the long, cold voyage had taken out of her, and it had taken a great deal, she came ashore a very sick young woman. Think about that arrival for a second, stripped of all the later romance. 10 o'clock at night, a dark harbour in a foreign country, a girl barely able to stand, carried or helped off a ship after days on a punishing sea, into a cold northern night, in a land where she knew almost no one, and could probably understand only some of what was being said around her. The treasure was unloaded, the jewels and the silver and the tapestries, all the wealth her father had sent to furnish her new life. And the Queen herself came off the ship a wasted, feverish teenager who'd spent the crossing being sick, set down at last on the soil of a kingdom she'd crossed the world to reach, and would be dead in within weeks. The contrast between the glittering cargo and the dying girl who owned it is about as stark as this story gets. Ships full of gold, and at the center of it, a body already failing. Now I have to tell you about the single most famous image in her entire story, the one that gets put on every thumbnail and folded into every short retelling of her life, and I want to tell it to you honestly, because honest is better and you deserve it. The story goes that when Madeleine landed in Scotland, she knelt down on the shore, took up a handful of Scottish sand and soil in her hands and kissed it, and asked God to bless this new kingdom of hers, this country she had crossed the sea and defied her father to reach. And it is a beautiful image, a frail young queen, sick from the voyage, sinking down to her knees on a foreign beach and kissing the very ground out of sheer love for the place. I would genuinely love to be able to tell you its solid fact. But that particular scene, the kneeling, the handful of earth, the kiss, the words, comes down to us mainly through a writer in the 19th century, an antiquarian named Robert Chambers, and not through a contemporary chronicler who was actually standing on the dock at Leith in 1537. The chroniclers closest to the event don't give us that picture, and it sits a little awkwardly against the hard evidence that she came ashore desperately ill, barely able to stand upright. So I'd offer it to you as one of those stories that gathers around a tragic young queen the way moss gathers on a stone slowly, over centuries, lovingly, and not quite truthfully. It might preserve the memory of something real, some gesture, some moment. It might be pure tenderness, invented and added long after the fact by people who wanted her to have had that moment. Either way, it's too telling and too tender to simply throw out, as long as we're clear together about where it actually comes from. What we do know, solidly, is that she went to Holyrood Palace, the royal residence down at the bottom of Edinburgh's long, sloping spine, on the 21st of May, and Edinburgh tried, genuinely, to celebrate her. The craft guilds of the city, the working men's fraternities, put on a procession up the high street, with French drummers and a French trumpeter and minstrels, and the hammermen, the guild of metalworkers, even stood the musicians a dinner afterward out of their own funds. The city was ready and willing to love her. James had been preparing for her arrival for months. He had ordered improvements at Falkland Palace, work on the Chapel Royal, new tennis courts, a French-style tower added onto Holyrood itself, all of it for her, to make a home and a court worthy of a daughter of France. There was going to be a grand royal entry into Edinburgh, a proper one, with pageants. There was going to be a coronation, the full sacred ceremony of making her a queen in the eyes of God and her new people. James had spent real money and real effort trying to turn cold grey Scotland into somewhere a French princess could be happy. The new tower at Holyrood, built in a softer continental style. The tennis courts, because the French played tennis. The repairs and improvements meant to make a rough northern court look a little more like the glittering world she'd come from. He was, in his hard, awkward way, trying to bring a piece of France to her, since he'd taken her away from the real one. And he was building it all for a marriage that was going to last 7 weeks. The workmen were very probably still finishing some of it when she died. The paint barely dry on rooms she'd never properly live in, courts she'd never watch a game on, a whole half-built welcome for a queen who came ashore already dying. None of it happened. Her health collapsed before any of it could take place. The scaffolding went up and the queen went down. There was one flicker of hope first, though, and that flicker is almost the cruelest thing in the whole story, because it let everyone around her believe, for a few weeks, that she might actually make it. On the 8th of June, she wrote a letter to her father from Edinburgh in her own hand, and that letter survives to this day. In it, she told him she was better, that her symptoms had eased. James had written to Francis, asking him to send a particular physician across the sea, a man called Master Francisco, and Madeleine, in her own letter, added that the doctor was now needed only to perfect her cure, to finish the job, to put the final touches on a recovery she clearly believed was already well underway. She signed the letter Madeleine de France. There was already a French doctor in her household, and another physician from Paris was setting out to join her. The whole machinery of saving her was in motion, doctors crossing the channel, remedies being prepared, and she herself, sitting in Edinburgh in early June, thought she was nearly through the worst of it, thought the danger had passed, thought she was getting well. A teenage girl in a foreign country, writing home to the father who'd begged her not to go, telling him not to worry, telling him she's better, telling him the doctors only needed to tidy up a recovery that's already happening. You can hear her trying to reassure him, trying to prove she'd been right and he'd been wrong to be afraid, trying to say in her own hand, "See, I made it. I'm going to be fine." That cruel false dawn is written right into the disease itself. Consumption does that. It eases and lifts and lets the dying believe they're climbing out, right before it closes in for good. So her last clear, hopeful words to her father weren't goodbye. They were the opposite of goodbye. They were a girl insisting she was about to get well, signed with her own name, sent across the sea to a man who would open it and read it and let himself hope, and then, not long after, receive the other letter, the one from her husband, the one that said she was dead. She was not nearly through the worst of it. Within a month, the catarrh that her gentlewoman would later describe came surging back and dragged her down fast. The flowing rheum descending into her stomach, the fever returning, the wasting that her doctors had no tools to stop, because in 1537 there simply were no tools. There was nothing. Consumption was a death sentence dressed up in a wardrobe of helpless, hopeful remedies, and the one remedy the age actually half believed in, the only thing they thought might genuinely help a wasting patient, was warm air and a gentle climate, and rest somewhere mild and dry. The medicine they would have prescribed her was France. And France was 400 miles of cold grey water behind her. So here is where everything folds back on itself, all of it, the whole long shape of her life snapping shut. A father who believed from her infancy that cold could kill this child, and who built her entire childhood around keeping her warm in the soft south. Physicians whose one genuine instinct about consumption was that warmth and gentle air gave a patient her only chance. A whole life, 16 years of it, organized around the single principle of keeping this fragile girl out of the cold. And then she fell in love, and she insisted, and she crossed the sea, and she carried herself by her own choice straight into the coldest, dampest, greyest corner of the known world, the exact place every careful instinct in her life had been warning against. We can't actually say the Scottish climate killed her. Advanced consumption might have taken her wherever she'd been, in the warmest room in France, in her father's gentlest valley. The disease was probably going to win regardless. But the people of the time drew the obvious, agonizing line straight from the cold north to her death, and her own gentlewoman blamed the catarrh that started after she arrived. And it's hard, knowing how her father had spent her whole life, not to feel the awful symmetry of it. The one thing he'd spent 16 years protecting her from is the thing she chose, and the thing she died in. On the 7th of July, 1537, Madeleine of Valois died at Holyrood Palace. She was a month short of her 17th birthday. The accounts say she died in her husband's arms. Her marriage had lasted 6 months and a week. She had been in Scotland for roughly 7 weeks. She never had her coronation. She never made her grand entry into Edinburgh. The tennis courts, and the chapel work, and the new French tower on Holyrood, all of it finished or half finished, for a queen who was already dead before she could ever use any of it. And here, finally, is where the nickname comes from, the Summer Queen. She arrived in Scotland in the late spring, and she was gone by high summer, her entire reign falling between the warming of the year and the very peak of it, as brief and as bright and as quickly finished as a Scottish summer itself, which anyone who has ever spent one will tell you is a fragile, fleeting thing, barely begun before it starts to slip away again. Some accounts say the poets who had been busily writing songs to celebrate her marriage simply set those songs down and picked up laments instead, turning the wedding verses into funeral ones with a few strokes of the pen. The Summer Queen. It's elegant. It's sad. And it does a quiet, gentle kindness to the sheer brutality of what actually occurred, which is that a 16-year-old girl coughed and wasted her life out in a cold stone palace, far from everyone she had ever known, after just 7 weeks in the country she had crossed an ocean to reach. The name softens her, of course. It makes her sound like a lovely seasonal thing, a queen of warmth and light who simply faded with the year. The actual death was uglier than that. Advanced consumption is not a gentle fading, it's fever and night sweats and a body wasting down to almost nothing, the cough bringing up matter and blood, the lungs slowly failing, the patient drowning by inches in a process that can take weeks. That's what those 7 Scottish weeks really held for her, underneath the pretty nickname. A teenager in a strange, cold palace, surrounded by people she'd known for a matter of days, doctors who could do nothing, a husband watching helplessly, her father's worst fear coming true 400 miles away from him where he couldn't even reach her in time. The Summer Queen is what we call her, so we don't have to look directly at that, and that's all right. People have always reached for a softer name when the real thing is too sad to hold. But you should know what the soft name is covering. James, by every account we have, was genuinely broken by her death. This hard, suspicious, grasping man, who had fathered 9 children by women he never married, and who treated his own nobles like personal enemies, seems to have actually truly loved this girl. He wrote to her father to break the news that she was gone, and in that letter he called her your daughter, my very dear companion. There is no performance that I can detect in that line. He had crossed the sea for her. He had rejected the safe, healthy bride for her. He had defied a worried, weeping father for her. He had married the sick one because he wanted her and no one else. And now, 7 months later, he was sitting down to write to that same worried father to tell him the thing the father had been afraid of from the very beginning. I'll be fair because fairness matters, and note that James was also a king who badly needed a legitimate heir, and that the slow machinery of finding him a second wife began turning before terribly long. Both of those things are true at once. He grieved sincerely, and he was a king, and kings, then as now, don't get the luxury of stopping being kings in order to grieve for very long. The funeral is where Madeleine leaves her strangest and most lasting mark on Scotland, and it's a grim one, so settle in for it. She was buried at Holyrood Abbey, the great old church standing right beside the palace, laid to rest near the tomb of an earlier Scottish king. And for her funeral, Scotland did something that, by the best evidence we have, it had never formally done before. The whole country went into black. An order was sent off to the merchants of the town of Dundee for black cloth, large quantities of it. Her household servants were given mourning gowns, dual gowns, dule being the old Scots word for grief, for sorrow, for mourning itself. The horses in the funeral procession were draped in black cloths and black trappings, dark from nose to tail. The chapel at Holyrood was hung throughout with cloth brought specially from Milan. The entire apparatus of organized public mourning, everyone in black, the building draped in darkness, the servants moving about in their grief gowns, the very horses shrouded. All of it was assembled for this French girl who had been in the country for less than 2 months. And according to the historian George Buchanan, writing later in that same century, this was the first time black mourning dress was used in Scotland. the first general public mourning the country had ever assumed. Now Buchanan is a later source, writing decades after the fact and with opinions of his own, and historians treat his confident first ever with appropriate care, because first is one of the hardest things in all of history to actually prove. What modern scholarship can say firmly is that Madeleine's funeral gives us the earliest genuinely detailed evidence of organised royal mourning display anywhere in Scotland, the earliest moment we can actually watch the records show an entire country putting itself into black. A scholar named Perrin Westerhoff Niemann went through the surviving funeral accounts in close detail a few years ago and laid all of this out. The orders, the cloth, the gowns, the draped chapel. So whether or not she was literally, provably the very first, the custom of Scotland dressing itself in black for its dead, the duel, the mourning weeds, the loose black gown with its hood drawn partway across the face, gets its first clear, documented footprint in the burial of a 16-year-old girl who had barely had time to arrive. She taught a whole country how to mourn, by being the thing it mourned. That word, duel, those dual gowns, the black hooded weeds, they kept turning up in Scottish royal mourning for decades and decades afterward, including, eventually, in the mourning for her own husband's daughter. We will get there. The thread runs further than you'd think. That black meant more than grief. It was also a statement. A royal funeral in the 16th century was a piece of political theatre as much as a piece of mourning. Putting an entire court, an entire procession, an entire chapel into black, draping the horses, gowning the servants, hanging the walls with imported Milanese cloth that cost an enormous amount of money, and it was meant to be seen. It announced to the world that this dead girl had mattered, that she had been a real queen, a daughter of France, the bride of the King of Scots, and that her loss was a national loss worthy of a nation's black. James, in his grief, was also making a statement to France, to his own nobles, to the watching ambassadors, that he had honoured her properly, that the daughter Francis had entrusted to him had been treated like the treasure she was, right to the grave. So the black served two purposes at once: sincere sorrow, almost certainly, and the careful, expensive language of royalty, speaking even over a coffin. For a girl who never got her coronation, who never made her grand entry into Edinburgh, who never got to be queen in any of the public ceremonial ways that were planned for her, this dark, draped, costly funeral was, in a grim way, the one great royal ceremony Scotland actually gave her. She got her procession after all. It just happened to be her funeral. So that's the death, and that's the burial. But Madeleine's story does not quite come to rest at the grave, partly because of what happened to James in the years afterward, and partly because of what happened to Madeleine's actual physical body, long after she was past all caring about it. First, James. He needed a wife, and he needed a legitimate heir, and the alliance with France still needed feeding, so within a year he was married again. He sent a man named David Beaton across to negotiate the new match, and the woman he ended up with was Mary of Guise, a tall, capable, formidable, recently widowed French noblewoman. And here's a small, sad thread that connects her right back to Madeleine. Mary of Guise had actually been present at Madeleine's wedding, there in the crowd of cloth of gold ladies, and by some accounts the two of them had been friends. So James's second queen had stood and watched his first queen marry him in Notre Dame, and now, a little over a year later, she stepped into the place that the dead girl had held for 7 short weeks. There's a famous aside about Mary of Guise, too, that James's own uncle, Henry VIII of England, also tried to marry her after one of his own wives died, and that she put him off with a sharp little line about how, though she was a big woman, she had only a little neck. A pointed joke, given Henry's well-established habit of removing the heads of the wives he had grown tired of. She married James instead. On balance, almost certainly the safer of her 2 royal suitors. A quiet irony runs through that second marriage, one I can't quite leave alone. James, who had defied a king and rejected a contract and crossed the sea to marry the sick French girl he'd fallen for, ended his search for a second wife by sending an envoy to fetch another French woman in a perfectly ordinary, businesslike, arranged way. The romance, the dramatic personal choosing, all of that had been spent on Madeleine. The second time around it was just statecraft, an alliance to be renewed, an heir to be got, a queen to be chosen on paper by ambassadors. He'd had his great romantic gamble, and it had died in his arms after 7 weeks, and now he did the sensible thing he'd refused to do the first time. Mary of Guise was, by every account, a capable and intelligent woman who became an important figure in Scottish history in her own right. But she came into the marriage as the practical choice, stepping into a place that had been carved out and then emptied by a girl she'd known and watched marry the same man. James and Mary of Guise had 2 baby sons together, and both of those little boys died in infancy, within days of one another, in 1541. So James, who had already lost Madeleine, then lost both of his legitimate heirs almost at a single stroke, and the following year, 1542, the whole thing came apart for him completely. He refused to follow his uncle Henry out of the Catholic Church, refused even to turn up to a meeting Henry had arranged and waited for, and the result was an English invasion of Scotland. James's army was routed at a boggy place called Solway Moss in November 1542. He wasn't even present for the worst of the disaster, but the news of the defeat seems to have broken something in him that was already cracked. Already ill, possibly with the same kind of wasting collapse, possibly with a fever, possibly with something closer to despair. He took to his bed at Falkland Palace, and while he lay there dying, word arrived that his wife had given birth, not to the son he so badly needed, to a daughter. The story, and I'll flag for you that it's almost certainly too neat to be literally true, that it comes down to us through John Knox and others writing with their own agendas, is that James, hearing that the Stuart crown had now come down to a baby girl, murmured something about how the crown had come into his family through a woman, long ago, and would now pass out of it through a woman. It came with a lass, he supposedly said, and it'll go with a lass. And then he turned his face to the wall and died, just 6 days after his daughter was born. He was 30 years old. They buried him at Holyrood Abbey, the same church, near the same spot beside his 2 infant sons, and not far at all from Madeleine, the summer queen he had crossed the sea and defied her father to win. 5 years he'd outlived her. 5 years between the French girl dying in his arms and him dying with his face to the wall at Falkland, in one of the very palaces he'd been doing up for her. The man buried his first queen and his 2 baby sons, and then joined them all in the same abbey before he was 31. And that baby girl, the lass the crown supposedly came down to, the 6-day-old queen left behind when James died, was Mary, Queen of Scots. So Madeleine's death is, in a strange, far-reaching dynastic way, the hinge that the whole of Scottish history afterward turns upon. If she had lived, if she had given James the healthy heir that everyone in 2 kingdoms so badly wanted, then there is no need for Mary of Guise, and there is, in all likelihood, no Mary, Queen of Scots. At least not the Mary, Queen of Scots we know. The single most famous tragic queen in all of Scottish history exists in the precise shape she does partly, fundamentally, because a frail French girl died at Holyrood after 7 weeks, and her grieving husband had to start the whole business over from the beginning. The course of history pivots on the small, sick, 16-year-old body of a girl whose name most people have never even heard. And the echoes don't stop there, they actually deepen in a way that makes you sit back from the page. Mary, Queen of Scots, the daughter who came after Madeleine, would herself be sent off to France as a small child to be raised at the very same French court Madeleine had come from. She'd marry a French prince, become for a moment Queen of France herself, and then come home to Scotland a young widow to begin a life of almost unbroken catastrophe that ended, decades later, with her head struck off on an English scaffold. The French thread that Madeleine embodied, that she crossed the sea and died for, ran straight on into her successor's life and helped shape its disasters. Both of them, Madeleine and the Queen, who only exists because Madeleine died childless, ended up bound to that grey northern kingdom. The first one it swallowed in 7 weeks. The second one it chewed on for a lifetime before England finished the job. You can draw a line from a dying French girl coming ashore at Leith all the way to the most famous beheading in British history, and the line runs straight through one empty cradle, the heir Madeleine never lived long enough to give. History rarely lets you see its hinges this plainly. Here you can, and the hinge is a teenager nobody remembers. She wasn't entirely forgotten, though, not by everyone, and not at first. She was mourned in verse, which was how the 16th century kept and honoured its dead. The Scottish poet and herald David Lindsay, who had actually been the one to prepare the pageants for her grand reception into Edinburgh, the great entry that never, in the end, got to happen, wrote a lament for her after she died. He called it the Declaration of the Death of Queen Magdalene. And it's a genuinely grief-stricken thing to read, because here was a man who had built her a welcome, designed her arches and her scaffolding and her painted glory, and then had to stand and watch the whole thing curdle into a funeral instead. He writes, in it, to the city of Paris, the city that had received her with triumphal arches and laud and glory, and then he turns and addresses death itself directly, and says that death turned all of that glory into weeping. He had painted the scaffolding for her with gold and fine azure blue, for a celebration of her arrival, and death came and took it and made it grief. There's a man who built a party for a girl and ended up instead writing her elegy. You can feel the bewildered sorrow in it across 5 centuries. And think about Lindsay's particular position for a moment, because it's its own small tragedy folded inside the larger one. He was a herald, a master of ceremony, a man whose whole craft was the staging of royal spectacle, the pageants and processions and welcomes that made kingship visible. He had been given the most joyful commission of that kind imaginable. Build a welcome worthy of a French princess, a brand new young queen, the bride the king had crossed the sea for. He'd have been designing arches, planning the costumes and the speeches and the painted tableaus, the whole glittering choreography of her entry into Edinburgh. He built it all in anticipation, and then she came ashore dying, and faded over 7 weeks, and the welcome he'd built sat there unused while the city instead ordered black cloth from Dundee. The man who'd been hired to celebrate her arrival ended up among those mourning her death, and he took the same skill he'd have poured into her pageant and poured it instead into her lament. The scaffolding meant to carry her glory carried her grief instead. He said as much himself in the poem. She was mourned in France too. Latin epitaphs were composed for her by French scholars and humanists, the educated men of the age paying their respects in the formal language of learning. French verses were written for her, and one of the poets who wrote in her memory is a name you might actually recognize, Pierre de Ronsard, who went on to become one of the absolute giants of French Renaissance poetry, one of the great names of the whole century, and who, before any of that fame, had been a page in Madeleine's own household. A boy in her personal service, who grew up to be a great poet and remembered, in his lines, the frail princess he had once waited upon. Somebody had even written her a guidebook to Scotland before she ever sailed, a little description of the country she was going north to rule, its origins and its marvels and its strange far northern wonders, so that she would know the place she was going to. After she died, that little book was redirected, repurposed, eventually dedicated to someone else entirely, and printed for a wider audience. Even her welcome literature outlived her. There's a strange afterlife in that, when you sit with it. A girl who lived 16 years and reigned for 7 weeks left behind a surprising amount of writing, given how little time she had. Letters in her own hand. A lament by a Scottish herald poet. Latin epitaphs by French humanists. French verses, including some by a future master. A guidebook written for her arrival and repurposed after her death. For someone the world has mostly forgotten, she's actually unusually well documented, threaded through the records of 2 countries, mourned in 2 languages by men who'd known her, or served her, or built her welcome. The girl herself is gone, completely, almost without trace in the physical world. But the words she generated, the grief she caused, the ceremonies she set in motion, those survived. She's a person we mostly know through the sorrow she left behind in other people, which is, when you think about it, not the worst way to be remembered, even if hardly anyone reads any of it now. And her face survives, just barely, just. There's a small portrait of her by an artist called Corneille de Lyon, a jewel of a thing, the sort of little painted panel you could hold in the palm of one hand. It shows a delicate, fair, faintly sad young woman in a black dress with a square neckline. Several versions of it exist. One of them was held in a museum at Blois, down in the warm valley where she'd spent her sheltered childhood, until it was stolen in the 1990s and, as far as I know, never recovered. She had also been painted as a baby years earlier by another court artist when she was still small and warm and safe, and nobody yet knew what was coming. So we have her twice, as an infant in the soft protected light of the Loire, and as a young woman in black, already marked by the thing that was killing her, and almost nothing in between. Two faces of a girl who only ever got 16 years to grow a face at all. Something strange happens when you look at that little panel, knowing everything you now know. Corneille de Lyon very probably sat in front of her and studied her while she held still and looked back at him, a real girl in a real room being looked at closely enough to be set down in oil. Someone noticed the particular fairness of her, the delicacy, the set of her features, and caught it. And that small painted board outlasted her by centuries. It outlasted her tomb. It outlasted the abbey roof. It outlasted nearly every single person who ever said her name out loud. The girl herself is dust now. Dust that got disturbed and scattered and finally swept back together. But her face stayed, a fair, delicate young woman in a black dress, looking out of the 16th century at anyone who pauses in front of her. And then even that got taken. The Blois panel was stolen and never came back. Even her face, the last clear thing left of her, couldn't manage to stay put. Of course it couldn't. Almost nothing about this girl was ever allowed to stay where it was meant to. Now, I promised you the disturbing part, and I keep my promises around here. So here it is, and it's about what happened to her body long after she was past caring what anyone did with it. Holyrood Abbey, where she was laid to rest, did not stay a peaceful place, and Madeleine's rest got broken more than once over the centuries that followed. First, the English came back. In 1544, only 7 years after her funeral, an English force wrecked Holyrood, smashing the abbey as part of a brutal punishing campaign against Scotland that history later named, with grim understatement, the Rough Wooing. So her tomb was damaged within a single decade of her burial, while there were still people alive who had watched her come ashore. Then, much later, in the political chaos at the very end of the 1680s, when Scotland turned hard against the Catholic King James VII, a mob broke into the royal vault at Holyrood and violated the burials inside it. The long-dead kings and queens dragged into a religious and political riot that had absolutely nothing to do with any of them, centuries after they died. That Rough Wooing, by the way, is its own dark joke at her expense, if you follow the thread. The whole campaign got its name because it was Henry VIII's brutal attempt to force a marriage between his son and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, by burning and killing his way across the country until the Scots agreed. So the army that smashed Madeleine's tomb in 1544 was sent, in a roundabout way, in pursuit of the marriage of the very child who only existed because Madeleine herself had died without one. She crossed the sea for a marriage and died of it, and then, 7 years on, an army chasing a different royal marriage came through and broke open her grave on its way past. Her body couldn't even rest through the consequences of her own childlessness. The wars over who Scotland's next queen would marry rolled right over the bones of the queen who hadn't lived to prevent them. And then 1776. This is the one that genuinely gets to me. A mob got down into the royal vault again and desecrated the graves, and the tradition that comes down to us from it is properly ghoulish. The story is that Madeleine's head, after almost 240 years lying in the ground, was somehow still beautiful, still recognizable. The face of the summer queen, preserved against all reason and all decay, looking up out of the broken dark. And the story goes that someone, seeing it, stole it, took the head away. Whether that particular detail is literally true, or whether it's the very same impulse that gave us the kiss on the beach, that deep human need to make her into something more than a forgotten, decayed girl in a box, I genuinely cannot tell you. Stolen head legends attach themselves to beautiful dead women with a depressing, predictable regularity throughout history. But the desecration itself, the vault broken open, the royal remains scattered and disturbed and handled by strangers, that part is solid. That part really happened. And it happened more than once. And the people doing it were centuries removed from anyone who had ever known her, or who had any earthly reason to care that the bones they were scattering had once belonged to a frightened, hopeful 16-year-old French girl who had died of consumption a very long way from home. Picture what that vault actually became over those centuries, because it's grim in the plainest possible way. A royal burial place is supposed to be the one spot on earth where the powerful are finally safe, sealed in stone, left in peace, surrounded by their own kind. Holyrood's vault turned into the opposite, broken into during a religious riot, robbed, smashed by an invading army, forced open by a mob. The lead of the coffins stripped and sold by some accounts, because lead had value and the dead did not. Bones tipped out and mixed together until nobody could say with any confidence whose was whose anymore. Kings, queens, royal children, all of it disturbed and scattered and jumbled in the dark, generation after generation, by people who saw only old metal and old bones, and not the human beings they'd once been. Somewhere in that scattered, robbed, violated heap were the remains of the French girl who'd been laid there with the whole country dressed in black. She'd had the grandest funeral Scotland could give. And then she spent 300 years being treated like rubbish in a broken cellar. Her remains lay disturbed and scattered for a long stretch of time after that, in a vault that had been opened and robbed and broken into again and again across 2 full centuries. It wasn't until 1898 that anyone finally put it right. Queen Victoria, who had a deep and famous sentimental streak about Scotland and about the dead who slept in it, ordered the royal vault at Holyrood repaired, and the scattered remains gathered up and reburied together, properly, decently, with care, after all that long indignity. So the girl who may well have taught Scotland how to wear black, whose funeral was perhaps the very first time the entire country put itself into mourning, spent more than 300 years in a tomb that kept getting broken open and robbed before a completely different queen in a completely different century finally had her gathered up and laid back down to rest. By then, of course, nobody could say for certain which bones were hers. She went back into the ground anonymous, mixed in with the others, a handful of remains among a handful of remains, finally at peace, but no longer quite herself. The girl who'd crossed an ocean to be a queen ended up as a portion of an unsortable pile, gathered up by strangers out of pity 360 years after she died. She got 16 years, 11 months as a married woman, give or take a few weeks. 7 weeks as a queen in her own kingdom, and most of those weeks she spent sick in a bed at Holyrood, too ill for the coronation that was waiting and ready for her, too ill for the grand entry into Edinburgh that David Lindsay had so carefully built. A father who spent her entire life keeping her warm because he was terrified the cold would one day take her, and who turned out, in the end, to have been exactly, precisely right. A husband who crossed the sea and threw over a healthier bride to have her, and held her in his arms while she died, and was laid in the ground a few feet from her just 5 years later. A handful of jewels, a diamond ring that cost 1,100 crowns, a fleet of ships loaded down with treasure for a home she would live in for less than 2 months, a small, sad portrait of a girl in a black dress, and a name that almost nobody alive today remembers: the Summer Queen, gone before the season she was named for had even properly turned toward autumn. Thank you for staying with me all the way through this one, genuinely. The short lives are sometimes the heaviest of all to sit with, because there's so little of them to hold, and so much of that little is just loss, stacked up. If the forgotten ones are your sort of story, the people history quietly filed away and stopped saying out loud, then you already know where to find me, and I'll keep digging them up for as long as you keep coming back. Look after yourselves out there. Be gentle with the people around you. I'll see you in the next one.